She thought she would spend her last days there. But what she finds changes everything forever. Claire Harrison never imagined that this return would be different from the others. She had returned to that land so many times in thought, in dreams, in the long nights when her chest tightened with longing or guilt, and she never quite knew which of the two was stronger. But this time was different from all the others. This time, she wasn't going to visit a memory. She was going to move into it. The news had arrived 3 months earlier, in an office too cold for a January afternoon, in a voice too calm for such heavy news. The cardiologist had used big words, the kind doctors learn so they don't have to say what they really feel. She understood the essentials. Her heart had a serious problem. Not all at once, not dramatically like a movie scene, but slowly, silently, and stubbornly, demanding that she stop everything. No stress, no rushing. No more of the life she had built over the past 15 years working from sunup to sundown. And she had built a lot. A management position at a media conglomerate, the penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, with a view of the city waking up early, the 11-year marriage to Derek that had crumbled in less than 2 months when the job ended, and the money went with it. Derek left through the same door as prosperity, and Claire Harrison was left alone in an apartment too big for one person, with 2 dogs and a health that no longer forgave her. It was the dogs who noticed first that something had changed in her. Shadow, the German shepherd with dark fur and watchful eyes she had adopted as a puppy, had never left her side since the first episode, as if he had decided on his own that it was his job. And Goldie, the yellow lab with a chubby snout and the gentlest eyes, had started sleeping in her bed, something she had never allowed before. The two had become the most loyal, most constant, most honest family she had. When she made the decision to go to the Harrison family ranch in Montana, the one that had been abandoned for nearly 20 years since her parents had left to live with relatives in a distant city, the people around her said she was giving up on life. Her friend Megan cried on the phone for an hour. Her cousin Audrey said she needed treatment, not isolation. Even Julian Harrison, her older brother who lived in the big city and showed up on important dates with the same distant smile as always, called to say that decision was madness. But Claire Harrison had reached a point where what others thought weighed less than what her own heart could still handle, and her heart, at that moment, was asking for silence. She arrived on a September afternoon when the sun was slowly sinking and painting the tall grass a beautiful old gold. She got out of the car, opened the back doors, and Shadow and Goldie ran out across the field, as if they recognized the place by smell, as if their instinct held memories of things they had never lived but somehow already knew. She stood still, looking. The house was unrecognizable. What had once been a true home, with a porch with the smell of freshly brewed coffee, with her mother's voice calling everyone to dinner and the sound of the radio in the corner of the kitchen, was now a pile of old boards, leaning on one another as if they had gradually given up on standing. The roof had collapsed on the left side. The windows were just dark holes staring out at the field. The grass had grown up to the threshold where a wooden bench once stood, the bench where her father would sit in the afternoon to smoke his tobacco pipe and gaze at the horizon without saying much. Claire Harrison didn't cry. She didn't know if she was beyond tears or short of them. She stood there, her blue dress flapping in the warm afternoon wind, Shadow sitting steady at her right side, and Goldie leaning against her left leg, all 3 of them staring at that thing that had once been the beginning of everything in her life. She had come to stay, to live slowly through whatever her heart could still endure, to grow old in peace, if that was what was in store, on that piece of land that carried the Harrison family name. She thought she would spend her last good years there, quiet, without demands, waiting for her body to settle or not settle, in a peace she had been slow to accept, but which had, at some point, come to make sense. What she couldn't possibly know was that that land held things that would change everything. The first surprise came the following morning, when she woke up on an air mattress she had set up in the least damaged room of the house, a room in the back that still had a sturdy wall and part of the roof intact. Shadow was barking outside with a persistence she hadn't heard in a long time. At the rotted wooden gate that separated the property from the dirt road stood an elderly woman. She must have been about 68, white hair pulled back in a tight bun, a floral cotton apron covering a faded blouse, her skin bearing the marks of someone who had spent her entire life outdoors. She was holding a clay pot in her hands and looking at Claire with an expression that mixed surprise with something Claire couldn't immediately name. "I heard the car yesterday afternoon," the woman said, without ceremony. "I thought it was Silas Vance's son coming to look at the land again. Then I looked at the license plate, and it didn't match any I know. I'm Claire, daughter of Mr. Arthur and Mrs. Martha." The silence that followed was too long to be casual. The woman slowly set the pot down. "Arthur," she repeated, more to herself than to Claire. "Did you know him?" "I did." Her voice was short, unadorned. "I'm Pearl. I've lived on the property right next door since before you were born." Mrs. Pearl walked in uninvited, with the ease of someone who doesn't need permission for places she knows by heart. She set the clay pot, which was a thick, fragrant, hearty beef stew with fresh seasonings, on a crate Claire had improvised as a table, and began looking at the corners of the house with an expression of someone telling a story only to herself. "It's much worse than the last time I was here," she said. "When was the last time?" "About 8 years ago. I came in to pick up some seeds that Arthur had left stored in the barn. He asked for them by letter before he left for good." She turned to Claire. "Did you know about that?" Claire didn't know. She didn't know her father had been corresponding with the neighbor after he left. She didn't know he had asked for the seeds back. She didn't know a lot of things she would come to find out about what her father did when the family wasn't around to see. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Mrs. Pearl became a daily presence from then on. She would show up every morning with something in hand: a loaf of sourdough bread, a squash from the yard, a piece of cheddar cheese wrapped in a clean cloth, once a bottle of fresh lemonade she'd made herself. The two of them would have coffee together, and the conversation would come and go without hurry, like the water of a creek that's in no rush to get anywhere. The old woman was intelligent in a way that sometimes disconcerted Claire. She spoke with precision, without flourish, and made silences that seemed fuller of meaning than any long sentence. After about 3 days, Shadow had decided she could be trusted, and Shadow, in all of Claire's life, had only been wrong about that once, with Derek. It was on one of those mornings, between one cup and the next, that Mrs. Pearl said out of the blue, "Your father left something buried here on this property." Claire set her cup on the crate. "What do you mean?" "Before he left for good. I saw it, but I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place." The old woman looked out at the field, where Goldie was chasing a low-flying bird through the grass. "Now that you're here, I think it concerns you." The spot was under what used to be the front porch, a rusty metal box deep in the ground that took the two of them almost an hour of effort to dig up. Inside there was a plastic bag well sealed with tape wrapped around it several times, and inside the bag, protected from moisture as if her father knew they would be waiting a long time, there were folded papers. Claire sat in the grass with dirt still on her hands and began to read. Most of it was land documentation, old deeds with faded stamps, payment receipts, a handwritten will in that handwriting of her father's that she would recognize anywhere in the world. But there were also letters, many letters, written to someone named Samuel, in envelopes that had never been sealed or addressed. She didn't know any Samuel. She read the first one in silence, with Shadow lying beside her, head on its paws. Then the second. On the third, she stopped midway. She stared at the field for a long time, with that expression that Mrs. Pearl observed from the porch doorway, without saying a word. "You already knew?" Claire asked, without taking her eyes off the horizon. "I knew part of it," the old woman answered slowly. "Not all of it. Samuel was the name of a son that her father had had with another woman before marrying Claire's mother, decades ago, in a phase of life that her father had never mentioned to anyone at home. A son who had been raised by distant relatives because circumstances didn't allow it. That's what her father wrote in those letters, in that voice of his that always sounded more like an apology than a real explanation. A son who had grown up without knowing who his father was, a son who now, if the dates in the letters were right, would be about 40-something. Look, as I came to understand this part of the story, I had to stop and breathe, because there's a weight to this discovery that goes beyond the secret itself. It's a whole life that existed out there without the other side knowing. A person who woke up every day without knowing they had a sister, a brother, an origin different from the one they knew. Claire spent that night reading and rereading the letters by flashlight. They were written by her father to Samuel, written as if they were going to be sent but never were. He wrote them, folded them, kept them. He wrote to the son he didn't raise the way someone writes in a diary they never show anyone. In some letters he said he was going to find him one day. In others, with an honesty that hurt to read, he admitted he was too much of a coward for that. In the last letter, written a few months before her father left the ranch for the last time, there was an address in a neighboring town, and a phrase that kept circling in Claire's head for days on end. If anyone ever finds this, let it reach him before it's too late. That was when Julian called. She hadn't spoken to her brother since he'd tried to convince her to give up the trip. When his name appeared on her phone screen, she answered with a weariness that wasn't from lack of sleep. "I heard you're there," he said, without a hello, without a, "How are you?" "I am. I need to tell you something." Julian's voice had a different texture from the one she knew, slower, less certain. "A few weeks ago, a man got in touch with me. Said he was Dad's son." Claire's heart made that movement that the doctor had told her to avoid at all costs. It suddenly raced hard, as if she'd been startled. "His name is Samuel," she said softly. Silence on the other end of the line. "How do you know?" "Because I'm holding his father's letters in my hands right now." The silence stretched for what felt much longer than it actually was. Then Julian said something she wasn't expecting. "He wants to meet you." She looked at Shadow, who was lying at her feet with his head resting on his front paws, as he always did when he sensed she needed grounding. She looked out at the land, at what remained of the house, at the sunset, painting the sky orange and purple outside. She could have asked for more time. She could have said she wasn't ready. But those letters, that buried box, that final sentence from her father, they had prepared her for this moment without her ever knowing she was being prepared. "When is he coming?" she asked. Samuel arrived on a Thursday morning in an old car with a dent in the fender that pulled up to the entrance of the property with visible hesitation, as if the driver wasn't sure he was in the right place. He was a man of 43, grey at the temples, his face bearing a resemblance to Claire's father that hit her like a punch to the stomach when he stepped out. It wasn't the features that were the same. It was the gestures. The way he ran his hand through his hair before taking in the place. The posture when he stood still, looking at the destroyed house, his chin slightly lifted. "It's exactly how I imagined it," he said, not looking at her yet. "Did you know this place existed?" "He told me, when we met." Samuel turned and looked at her. In that gaze was a mixture of something she recognized immediately, because she herself had carried it for so long. It was the look of someone who had spent years trying not to need an answer and had ended up needing one anyway. He talked about this property as if it were the place where he was most himself. They sat down in the grass, no chairs, no table, no formality of any kind. Goldie went straight to Samuel's lap as if she had known him in another life, and he let out a soft chuckle as he received that unexpected affection, his large hand slowly stroking the dog's golden fur. "When did he find you?" she asked. "When I was 38. Samuel kept petting Goldie without hurry. "He showed up at my door like it was a perfectly normal visit. We spent an entire afternoon talking. He asked for forgiveness with words that were true. I could feel it." A long pause. "But I didn't know what to do with that at the time. It took me years to digest it. And when I finally knew what to do, I knew I needed to come here. And that's when you reached out to Julian. When I understood that time was passing and that I didn't want to live without at least trying to get to know the siblings." Samuel's face grew more guarded for a moment, his eyes drifting into the distance. "I didn't want to live forever with the feeling that I could have tried and didn't." There was a word in that sentence that made Claire go quiet for a moment. siblings. Said like that, in the plural, with the ease of someone who had already grown used to the weight of the word before even using it. I don't know about you, but that moment got me in a way I wasn't expecting. Because there's something very specific about the word brother when it comes from a place of absence. It carries both what was lost and what might still be found. Mrs. Pearl showed up at the end of the morning, as she always did, but this time with a pot of chicken and rice casserole that could easily feed 4 people. The old woman knew Samuel by sight. It turned out during lunch she had crossed paths with Claire's father in the company of a small child 2 or 3 times decades ago, and had never fully connected the dots. But she wasn't surprised. She had that way of older folks who had lived long enough that few things about human behavior could still astonish them. She sat with them and ate, and for an hour they were 3 people on a ravaged property and an old woman who knew that land better than any of them, sharing food and silences that were worth more than conversation. It was during that meal that Samuel took a folded paper from his shirt pocket with a care that drew attention. "Dad gave me this the day we met," he said. "It took me years to understand what it was because I didn't want to deal with any of that at the time." He handed the paper to Claire. "But Julian told me you're here and that there's an unresolved situation with the land." It was a document, old with registration, bearing the name of Claire's father and a description of a strip of land that sat exactly on the property boundaries, a stretch that had been silently disputed, with no public fuss, by a man named Silas Vance for over 15 years. The same Silas whose son Mrs. Pearl had mentioned on the first day, when she arrived at the gate thinking it was him. Claire looked at the old woman. Mrs. Pearl took a sip of water before answering the unspoken look. "Silas moved the markers when your parents left," she said with a calm that carried more weight than any shout could have. "He said he'd bought that strip. I know he didn't because I was here, I saw them leave, and there was no sale happening. But I'm an old woman who lives in a small clapboard house, and no one was going to take my word over a man with a forged document and a paid lawyer." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. Claire sat in silence looking at the paper in her hand for a long time. The situation was unfolding in a way she hadn't foreseen when she packed her bags and came with the 2 dogs to that place she thought was just an early retirement, a way to spare her heart from what the outside world demanded. Instead of quiet peace, she had found a half-brother she didn't know existed, an injustice that had lasted years without anyone digging deep, and a document that could change what belonged to the family, if it was valid. Julian arrived 2 days later, by car in a suit, with neatly cut hair and that way of someone who had spent his whole life trying to look like he had everything under control. When he saw Samuel outside the property, the 2 greeted each other with a firm handshake that carried the tension of people who don't yet know where the other fits into their own lives. The conversation that night was long and difficult, the kind you don't forget. Julian knew more than he had told anyone. He had been the only child to know about the half-brother's existence since he was about 25. His father had told him in a moment of drinking and regret on a trip the 2 took together, and then asked with a seriousness he never repeated that Julian keep it to himself forever. Julian kept it for almost 20 years, and the weight of a secret kept for so long has a name we don't say out loud, but Claire saw it clearly on her brother's face when he finally spoke. "I should have told you," he said to her, shoulders slumped. "Yes," she replied, no drama, no anger in her voice, just yes. "I didn't know how to start." "I know, Julian." There was something Claire had discovered in those weeks of open fields, quiet nights, and unhurried mornings. That resentment is too heavy to carry alongside other difficult things. Her heart already had enough work for what remained. The document Samuel had brought was shown to a lawyer Mrs. Pearl knew from a neighboring town, the son of a former student of hers, who had gone to law school and hadn't forgotten the debts of gratitude from his life. The man examined it carefully and confirmed that the document was legitimate and that the situation with Silas Vance had a legal path forward, as long as someone pursued it. But Claire didn't want to file a lawsuit. She went personally to the man's property on a hot afternoon in early October, with Shadow walking steadily by her side. Silas was older than she expected. well past 70, his skin marked by decades of sun, the look of someone accustomed to facing things head-on and coming out on top most of the time. But she wasn't there to confront him. She was there to show him the document and ask, directly, without beating around the bush, whether he wanted to settle the matter in a way where they both walked away with dignity, or in a way where they both wore themselves out for years, in a lawsuit that could have been avoided. Silas's silence lasted about 3 minutes. She counted them. "Your father was a good man," he said at last, without looking at her. "I took advantage of the fact that he left without fighting." "I know. There's no way to undo what's already been done. You can do what can still be done." They stayed right there, on the man's terrace, and in 2 hours they reached an agreement. It wasn't pretty or easy, and Claire left with a weariness that went beyond the physical, but she left with a signed paper. The strip of land would return to the family name within 90 days. Shadow lay in the shade throughout the entire conversation and only got up when she got up, as if he knew exactly when it was time to go. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift slowly in the rhythm of those days. Samuel went back to the city where he lived, but they started talking on the phone almost every day, with that pleasant awkwardness of people getting to know someone for the first time while discovering old things within the conversation at the same time. Julian, who had stayed for 2 more days, left different from how he'd arrived, more open, less guarded, as if the weight of a secret kept for so long had finally found a place to rest that wasn't only on him. And Claire kept staying. She began clearing the area around the destroyed house with a calm that came not from obligation, but from something deeper she still couldn't quite name. Mrs. Pearl came to help when she could, and sometimes she brought her granddaughter, Sophie, a young woman in her 20s who was studying architecture and had come to spend her vacation with her grandmother. The young woman arrived one day looking at the rubble with professional eyes and an excitement that Claire found beautiful to see. "You could do something really lovely here," Sophie said, walking around the fallen boards as if she were already sketching it in her head. Not the same as it was, different, better. That stayed with Claire for many days. Different, better. She hadn't come there to rebuild anything. She had come to land, to slow down, to accept that the life she'd known had come to an end, and that what came next would be slower and quieter. But what she was discovering day after day in that field was that landing on top of a story that hadn't resolved itself isn't rest, it's waiting. And she had waited long enough. One afternoon, as the sun was sinking slowly and turning the grass that golden color she had seen on the first day she arrived, Claire stood in front of the destroyed house with Shadow and Goldie sitting on either side of her, just like that first afternoon. But she wasn't looking at the ruin. She was looking at the space, at what that place could become. The doctor had said she needed peace, a slow rhythm, a heart that wasn't being squeezed by the weight of the world at every moment. He hadn't said she needed to stop living. She had confused the two things for a long time. She called Samuel Harrison that night, while the sky darkened and the stars came out one by one over the field. "Would you be up for spending a few days here? I want to show you something." "What kind of thing?" She looked at her father's letters, which she had carefully kept safe in a new box. "That Dad had big flaws," she said calmly, "but that he also left us something good. And that we can decide what to do with both things together." Samuel was quiet for a moment, a silence she respected and didn't try to fill. "I'll come," he said. "There are things you only learn when life stops by force, without asking permission." Claire had learned that a heart with a problem can lead a person to the right place, that a destroyed house can hold more than old wood. That family sometimes is something you discover when you're over 40, on a piece of open field, among yellowed papers and a dog that knows how to choose people better than we do. She didn't yet know everything that was to come, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare her. It was a not knowing that tasted like a beginning, not an end. The end. And that's it, folks. This is the story of Claire Harrison, of Mrs. Pearl, of a father who left more secrets than goodbyes, and of a brother who appeared from where you least expect. Tell me what you thought and where you're watching this from, because I love to know. Do you think she made the right decision in facing Silas Vance alone? the way she did? Tell me in the comments. I'll read every single one. And if this story touched you in any way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for your company, as always.